Della Hartwell buried her husband on a Tuesday. By Saturday, the bank had her selling his life across 2 card tables in the yard. Strangers walked her grass. They picked up his tools and turned them over in their hands and set them down wrong. She did not weep in front of them. She stood by the porch rail and she counted change into a cigar box, coin by coin, and her face gave them nothing. Then the Corcoran Seed Man came late and got loud. He stood where the neighbors could hear him. "I'll take the fool's corn off your hands, ma'am," he said. $1 for the whole crate of jars. 40-odd townsfolk watched her take the coin. They had a name for Amos Hartwell in that county, the man who played with corn while his fields dried up. What none of them knew, not the buyer, not the widow, was that a man from the state college would drive into that yard by afternoon. He would look at one of those jars, and he would go white to the lips. If you believe respect is earned in silence, this story is for you. Before we go on, if stories like this one find you where you live, subscribe to the channel so the next one reaches you. And tell me in the comments what city you're watching from. I read them. I like knowing who's out there in the dark, listening. Now, let me take you back to the start of it. Marl Creek, Nebraska, the spring of 1934. There was dust on every windowsill in that town, and no woman alive could keep it off. You wiped a sill at breakfast, and it was gray again by supper. It came in under the doors. It came in around the glass. It settled in the folds of the curtains, and it ground itself into the flour if you weren't quick with the lid. The whole country was blowing away that year, a little at a time, and Marl Creek was blowing with it. Della and Amos Hartwell had 40 acres a mile south of the creek. 30 years married, the two of them, and no children ever came. They had made their peace with that a long time back, the way farm people make peace with weather. You don't argue with what the Lord withholds. You get up and you do the milking anyway. 40 acres, and a note against most of it. That's the truth of nearly every farm you ever admired from the road. The house was small and square and white once. The barn leaned a little to the north where the wind had leaned on it for 40 years. There was a windmill that squeaked on the downstroke, and Amos had meant to grease it for as long as Della could remember, and now he never would. He died of a weak heart. That was the doctor's word for it. Weak, it went through Della like a splinter every time she heard it. Because there was nothing weak about the man. He'd carried her father's coffin. He'd pulled a breech calf in a February storm with his bare arms to the shoulder. Weak heart. It just quit one morning between the porch and the pump, and he sat down in the yard like a man who'd remembered something, and by the time she reached him, he was gone. You would have liked Amos Hartwell. I want you to understand that before the rest of it. He was a quiet man, not a cold one. He had a slow way of looking at a thing before he spoke on it. Corn, weather, a horse, a neighbor's trouble, he studied it all the same patient way. He wasn't much for church talk or town talk. He'd sit on a nail keg outside the feed store and let the other men run their mouths. And now and then he'd say one thing, and it would be the true thing, and they'd all go quiet a second before they went back to being foolish. And he had his corn. That was the thing about Amos. That was the thing the whole town made its little joke on. For 20 years he had kept a back plot behind the barn. Not the cash corn. The cash corn ran in the west field, and it did what everybody's did those years, which was mostly fail. No, the back plot was small. A few long rows, tended by hand, and Amos out there in every hour he could steal from the real work. Evenings, Sundays after dinner. First light before the chores, when Della would look out the kitchen window and see him bent over a single stalk like a man reading fine print. He saved seed. He kept it in jars. Mason jars, quart size, the same as she put up beans in, and he sealed them and he labeled them in his small square pencil hand, and he carried them down to the cellar and lined them on a shelf he'd built for that one purpose. Row on row of them down there in the cool dark. Corn in glass. Amos and his jars. That's what they said in Marl Creek. Said it gentle, mostly the way you'd talk about a man's limp. There goes Amos to fuss over his jars. Bet Amos has got a new jar. His field's drying up and blowing off, and the man's out back counting kernels. They didn't say it to be cruel. That's almost the worst of it. They said it the way you'd pity a thing. And here is what I have to tell you, and I want you to hold on to it, because it matters at the end. Della half believed them. She did. Lord forgive her, she did. She loved that man to the bone, and she never once told him to stop. Not in 20 years. But somewhere down under the love there was a small cold thought she never let up into the light. The thought that maybe the town was right. That maybe all those evenings and all those Sundays, all that patience poured out over a few rows of corn nobody would buy, maybe it had been a waste of the only years they were ever going to get. She could have used him in the West Field. She could have used him at her side of an evening, resting, the two of them, instead of him out there in the dark with a lantern and his little book. She never said it. But it was in her. And grief has a way of turning your own quiet thoughts against you. Because here is what came 4 days after they put him in the ground. The note. Della had known there was a note. She hadn't known its size, not to the dollar, because Amos handled the bank and she handled the house, and that was how it had always been between them. So when she went into the Prairie Trust in her black dress, the Monday after, and sat across the desk from Mr. Harlan Beck, she did not know yet what she was walking into. $1,180. That was the figure. Beck said it soft, and he turned the ledger so she could see it, as if seeing it would help. $1,180 against the farm, and the note come due in 9 weeks. Della sat very still. 9 weeks. She did the arithmetic the way a drowning person does arithmetic, fast and useless. There was maybe $60 in the cigar box. There was some stock. There was the fall crop, if there was a fall crop, if it rained, if the wind laid down, if the hoppers stayed north. 9 weeks and $1,180 and a widow alone. Now, Della, Beck said. He'd known Amos his whole life. He wasn't a bad man, only a bank man, which is a different kind of thing. I don't want to see you lose the place. Nobody does. But the note's the note. And then he said the thing that started the rest of it. Was thinking. You've got equipment out there. Household goods. Amos's stock. A sale might bring you a good part of it, get you square or near it. Folks'll turn out for a Hartwell sale. An estate sale. That was the bank's idea. I want that clear. Della Hartwell did not wake up one morning and decide to sell her husband across 2 card tables in the yard. The bank decided it for her, gently, the way the strong always decide things for the weak. And she was too tired and too frightened and too new to her widowhood to fight it. She said all right. She said it looking at the number in the ledger. She went home and she started, God help her, to price her own life. They set the sale for that next Saturday. The days between were their own kind of hard. Della went through the house room by room with a stub of pencil and a roll of paper tags. And she put a price on things that had no price. Her mother's dishes. The good ones, white with a blue vine around the rim, brought out from Ohio in a barrel packed in straw when Della was a bride. She tagged them. The plow. Amos's good plow, the one he'd saved 2 years to buy, that turned a furrow so clean the neighbors borrowed it. She tagged that. His tools, hung on the barn wall, each in its outline he'd painted, so he'd know at a glance what was missing. She tagged the wall. And the jars. She stood at the top of the cellar stairs a long while before she went down for those. It was the last room she priced. The cellar was cool, and it smelled of earth and old apples and the paraffin she sealed her preserves with. Her beans and her tomatoes and her chow-chow lined one wall, and Amos's corn lined the other. Row on row of quart jars, the kernels inside every color a kernel can be. Pale gold, deep red, a blue so dark it was near black, speckled ones, striped ones the plain yellow of field corn, and ones she had no name for. Each jar labeled in his small square hand, not with names, with numbers and letters, codes she'd never asked him to explain. She didn't know what to price them at. Who buys a jar of corn? So, she didn't price them one by one. She carried them up, load by load, and she set them in a wooden crate, and she meant to sell the crate whole for whatever a body would give, because that was all such things could be worth. Seed corn nobody wanted, from a man everybody smiled at. While she was clearing his shelf, one jar sat apart from the rest. She almost didn't notice it. It was pushed to the back corner of the shelf, half behind the post, and around its neck, tied careful in a bow gone stiff with age, was a length of red twine. Just plain red twine, the kind for tying tomato plants. And on its label, in Amos's hand, not a code this time, but words. 2 words and a line under them. Keep, do not sell. Della stood with it in her hands. It was heavier than it looked, packed full. The kernels inside a dark even red like old brick, all one color, all one size, nothing like the jumble in the other jars. She turned it and read it again. Keep, do not sell. He'd pressed so hard on the pencil the line under it had near cut the paper. And I have to tell you the truth of that moment, because the truth is what makes it hurt later. She didn't understand it. She didn't feel a chill. She didn't hear his voice. She was a bone-tired woman with 9 weeks to find $1,100, and here was one more of her husband's mysteries she'd never have explained to her now. She thought, he was particular about this one. That was all. He was particular. She almost set it back on the shelf. Then she thought the shelf itself was being sold, the boards and all, and there'd be no shelf to set it on. So she laid it in the crate with the others, red twine and all, on the top where she could see it, and she carried the crate up into the light. She did mention it. That week, a neighbor woman came by with a hot dish, the way they do, and stood in the kitchen offering the useless kind comfort. And her eye fell on the crate of jars by the door. "What'll you do with all that corn?" the woman asked, not unkind, just filling the air. And Della said, "Sell it, I suppose." He had one he liked especial. She nodded at the red twine jar, was particular about that one, wouldn't ever say why. And the woman clucked and said, wasn't that just like Amos, and that was the end of it. 2 women in a kitchen, and the whole fortune of it sitting there in the corner catching the light, and neither one of them knowing. The night before the sale, Della found the book. She was clearing out the little desk in the front room, the one Amos kept his few papers in, and behind the seed catalogs and the tax receipts her hand came on a ledger. Cloth cover, worn soft at the corners, thick as a Bible. She opened it at the kitchen table by the lamp. Columns, page after page of columns in his small square hand, going back years, back near 20 years, the ink faded brown at the front, and fresh black at the back. Down the left, numbers she took to be rows. Across the top, dates, and in between, in every square, a mark. This row crossed to that row. An arrow here. A word she didn't know. Roguing, it said. Over and over, roguing, and beside it dates and weathers. Stood the drought, said one line. Lodged, said another, with a line struck through the row. Ear to row, said a heading at the top of a page, underlined twice. Ear to row. She turned the pages a long time. She didn't understand a word of it, not really. And I'll tell you what she thought. Sitting there the night before she sold him off. Because it's the hardest thing in this whole story to forgive, and she never did forgive herself for it. She thought, this is the scribbling of a man who should have been mending fence. She thought it, and she was ashamed of it even as she thought it, and she closed the book and she couldn't put it in the sale. She couldn't bear strangers reading his hand, so she set it on the shelf by the stove where her own receipt book went. And she went up to bed, and she lay in the dark on her side of it, and she did not sleep. Saturday came bright and windy. They turned out for it. Beck was right about that much. A Hartwell sale drew the county, and by 9 there were wagons and a few coughing trucks along the section road, and men in the yard with their hands in their pockets, and women going through the household tables, and children underfoot. The auctioneer was a fellow named Paulie from up at the county seat, with a voice like a saw. Della had a chair on the porch. She'd meant to stay inside, but it seemed to her that if she was going to make them look at her while they carried Amos off, she'd make herself look back. So she sat on the porch with the cigar box in her lap, and she watched. It's a particular thing, to watch strangers price your life. The plow went first, near, for less than half what he'd paid. A man from over east bought it, and Della watched him load it, and she thought of the 2 years Amos saved. His tools went in a lot, the whole painted wall of them, to a young fellow just starting who'd never know what each outline meant. Her mother's dishes brought $1.25, the whole set, blue vine and all. And a woman Della hardly knew wrapped them in newspaper right there on the grass, and that was Ohio gone, and the barrel, and the straw, and the bride. Della did not weep. She had decided she would not, and she did not. She sat straight and she counted the coins into the box as Polly's boy brought them up to her, and she said thank you, and thank you, and thank you. To people who could not meet her eye, there is a kind of dignity that looks like coldness from the outside. It was the only kind she had left, and she wore it like her black dress buttoned to the throat. By afternoon the good things were gone, and they were down to the leavings. The odds. The chipped, and the broken, and the strange. And on the last table, in the wooden crate, sat the jars. Nobody bid on them. Polly tried. He held up a jar and turned it in the sun so the kernels caught the light, red and gold and that near black blue, and he made his patter, pretty as jewelry, folks, seed corn, put it in the ground and eat all summer, and the crowd just looked. A few laughed, soft, somebody in the back said, "That's Amos's play corn," and there was that gentle laughter again. The pity laughter, and it went around the yard and it reached the porch where Della sat, and she heard it. Amos's play corn. 20 years of Sundays. And not a hand went up. And that was when the truck came. You heard it before you saw it, laboring up the section road with a rack on the back and a name painted on the door in gold-shadowed letters, Corcoran Seed Grain Co. It pulled into the yard scattering chickens, and it stopped, and a man got down from it, and the crowd turned to look, because he was a stranger, and he was loud even in the getting down. Vernon Sledge. That was his name, though Della didn't know it yet. A big soft man in a good suit gone dusty, with a hat pushed back off a red forehead and a way of looking at things. At the barn, at the house. At her on her porch like he was already pricing them and finding them cheap. A field buyer, a company man. Corcoran ran seed houses across 3 states, and they sent men like Vernon Sledge out into the dying country to buy up whatever the dying let go of. He came across the yard easy, nodding at folks, playing the crowd. And he went straight to the last table, straight to the jars like he'd come for them, and maybe he had. He picked one up. He held it to the light the way Polly had, but different. Polly held it up to sell it, and Sledge held it up to weigh it, and something moved behind his eyes that was not laughter at all. Just for a second. Then he set it down and he turned to the crowd, and he put the laughter back on his own face like a hat. "Now what's all this?" he said, big, so the yard could hear. "Jars of corn?" He looked around, grinning, gathering them to him. "This the famous Hartwell corn I've been hearing about? Fella that played with his corn while the wind took his fields?" And they laughed. God help them, Della's own neighbors laughed, because a stranger had given them leave to, out loud now, not gentle anymore. The pity had a permission, and it turned mean the way pity does. Sledge let them laugh. Then he turned to the porch. He found Della with his eyes, and he tipped his hat, and he raised his voice so not a soul in that yard would miss a word. "Tell you what, ma'am. I'm a soft-hearted man." He put his hand flat on the crate. "Nobody here wants these, and I hate to see a widow left with a box of trouble. So I'll do you a kindness. I'll take the whole crate off your hands. The fool's corn in the jars and all." He reached in his vest and he brought out a coin, and he held it up between 2 fingers so it caught the sun. $1 for the lot. And I'll haul it off myself so you don't have to look at it. $1. The yard went quiet. Even the mean laughter died, because there's a point where even a cruel crowd feels the edge of a thing. And this was that point. 40-odd people stood in Della Hartwell's yard and watched a company man offer a widow $1 for her dead husband's life work and call it charity. And there was not a sound but the windmill squeaking on the downstroke. Della looked at the coin. She looked at the crate and the red twine jar sitting on top of it where she'd laid it, "Keep, do not sell," facing up at her in Amos's hard-pressed pencil. She looked at the number in her mind, 1180, 9 weeks. And she looked at all those faces waiting to see what the widow would do. She got up from her chair. She walked down the 2 porch steps in her black dress. She crossed the yard, and the crowd opened for her, and she came to the table and she stood in front of Vernon Sledge and his $1. I don't know what she felt. I've thought about it a long time and I don't know. Shame, surely, and under the shame, so tired she could have laid down in the dust and not got up. And under that, maybe, the small cold town thought she'd carried 20 years, whispering that they were right, they were all right, it was only play corn, it was only jars, it was worth about $1 and always had been. She held out her hand. And Vernon Sledge, smiling, laid the coin in it. "There now," he said, to the crowd more than to her. Widows squared away. "Somebody give me a hand with this crate." 2 men lifted it. They carried her husband's 20 years across the yard and slid it onto the rack of the Corcoran truck. Jars clinking, the red twine jar on top riding the whole way with its 2 words showing. And Della stood in the middle of the yard with $1 in her closed hand, and she watched it go. She did not weep. She had said she would not, in front of them, and she did not. The sale broke up soon after. There wasn't much left worth carrying home. The wagons pulled out one by one, and the trucks coughed to life, and the yard emptied of everyone who'd come to watch. Until it was only Della and the 2 card tables, and the trampled grass and the long light coming yellow across the fields. And the crate was gone. And so, though she didn't know it yet, was a thing worth more than every acre in that county laid end to end. Sledge had gone too, in a hurry once he had the crate, no more soft words. But he'd said one thing to the man who helped him load, low, thinking the widow couldn't hear. He'd said, "Rest of it's still in the cellar, I'd bet. Old boys like this never keep it all in one place. I'll come back around." And then the truck was gone up the road in its own dust, and Della barely marked the words, because she was looking at the empty grass where her mother's dishes had lain. That night was the worst of it. The house was hollow. She'd never known how much of a house is the things in it until the things were gone. She sat at the kitchen table where she'd read his ledger, and she did not light the lamp for a long time. And when at last she stirred herself, it was out of the plainest habit. She thought she'd go down cellar and bring up a jar of her tomatoes for her supper. Because a body has to eat even the day she sells her husband. She took the candle, and she went down the cellar stairs. And she stopped at the bottom. Because the shelf was there, the shelf Amos built. And it was empty. She'd carried it all up herself, every jar, days ago, but she hadn't come down since, and in the candlelight the bare boards of it hit her like a blow she hadn't braced for. 20 years. Row on row of them, all his patient winters, and now just dusty rings on the wood where the jars had stood. Gone. Sold, carried off in a stranger's truck for $1. She put her hand on the empty shelf and the candle shook and the shadows swung, and something in Della Hartwell that had held all week, buttoned to the throat, finally gave. She didn't cry loud. That wasn't her. She cried standing up with her hand on the empty boards and the candle in the other hand, the tears just running, silent. In the cold cellar under her own dead house. She cried for the dishes and the plow and the 30 years and the weak heart that was the strongest thing she ever knew. And she cried, worst of all, for the small cold thought. Because now, standing at the empty shelf, she could not remember why she'd ever believed it. Play corn. She'd let them call it play corn. She'd half called it that herself. And now it was gone, and she could never take one of those jars in her 2 hands and tell him she was sorry she hadn't understood. And there in the dark, crying, she remembered his rule. It came up in her like something rising from deep water. His one rule about that corn, the only firm word he'd ever laid down in 20 years of gentleness. He'd said it once, years back in this very cellar, holding the red twine jar, and she'd forgotten it clean until this minute. He'd said, "Della, whatever comes, you never sell this one. You never plant it out where it can cross. This one you keep. Promise me." And she'd laughed and said, "What would I want with your corn, Amos?" And he hadn't laughed back. He'd just looked at her that slow studying way until she said, all right, I promise." And she'd sold it. That afternoon. For $1. It had ridden off on the top of the crate with the twine still around its neck. The tears stopped. That's the strange thing. The remembering of the promise dried them right up, because shame is a hot thing and it burns tears off. She stood at the empty shelf, and the pain in her turned, right there in the cellar, into something with a spine in it. She'd broken the one promise he ever asked her to keep. And she couldn't unbreak it. The truck was gone. But the truck, she thought. The truck was only gone up the road. And that man had said he'd come back around. She didn't sleep that night either. But it was a different not sleeping. The week's not sleeping had been fear. This was something else. She lay in the dark and she turned the promise over and over. Never sell this one. And she thought about how hard he'd pressed the pencil. Keep, do not sell. Twice he'd told her, in words and in writing, and both times she'd half heard him, the way she'd half heard him for 20 years. And now she was wide awake at 3 a.m, hearing him at last. Morning brought a neighbor. Old Tom Ackley, who'd farmed the quarter section east of the Hartwells since before either of them was married, come to pay a proper respects now the crowd was gone. He stood in the kitchen with his hat in his hands, and he said the plain, awkward things men say. And Della gave him coffee because there was still coffee, and they sat, and Tom, casting about for something to fill the quiet, landed on the corn. "Shame about Amos's seed going off cheap," he said. "Though I never did understand the man's fuss over it." He turned his cup. "Tell you a queer thing, though. You mind the summer of the big blowout? 34, no, before that. The year it come down blight and drought both, and the whole county's corn just laid down and died in the field? Della minded it. Everyone minded it. Well, Tom shook his head slow. Amos's back plot stood green as June, right through it. I seen it myself, riding by. Everybody's corn burnt up and brown, and his little rows standing there like the Lord had drawn a line around him." He gave a small, baffled laugh. "Queerest thing. We never asked him how. Figured it was luck. Low spot, maybe, held the water. He drank his coffee. Never asked him. You know how he was. Wouldn't have said if we had." Della sat very still with her own cup going cold in her hands. Green as June, right through the year that killed the county. She'd been alive that summer. She'd been in this house. And she had not seen it, or she'd seen it and made nothing of it, the way she'd made nothing of the ledger and nothing of the twine and nothing of the man himself, bent over his rows in the last good light of 20 years of evenings. Never asked him how. Tom left, and Della stood at the kitchen window a long while looking out at the back plot behind the barn, plowed under now and blowing like everything else, and she thought about a jar of dark red kernels riding off on a stranger's truck. Then she went and got her coat. Because it came to her, all at once and plain as day, that the crate might still be sitting on that truck. Sledge had said he'd come back around for the rest, which meant he hadn't gone far, which meant maybe, the crate hadn't been carried off to some warehouse yet. Maybe it was still on the rack, still in the county, and one jar in it wound in red twine that she had promised a dying man she would never let go. But she didn't have to go anywhere. That's the thing. When she came out onto the porch buttoning her coat, the crate was there. It sat in the yard, in the trampled grass by the 2 card tables, right where the sale had ended. Sledge, in his hurry the evening before, or his men, had set it down to shift some other load and never put it back up, or meant to swing back for it, that one crate, along with the rest he was sure was in the cellar. Whatever the reason, there it stood in the morning light, jars and all, forgotten in the widow's yard. And on the top of it, catching the sun, the red twine jar. Keep, do not sell. Della walked out to it slow. She stood over it. She could have taken the whole crate back inside. It was in her yard, on her grass, nobody there to say her nay. But that's not what she did. And I want you to understand that she wasn't being clever. She wasn't scheming. She didn't reach for the crate. She reached for the one jar. She lifted the red twine jar out of the crate with both hands, the way you lift a thing that's heavier than it looks, and she held it against her a moment. Then she turned and carried it back across the yard, up the 2 porch steps, into the kitchen. And she set it on the windowsill over the sink, in the light, where she'd see it 100 times a day. That was all. One jar. She left the whole rest of the crate sitting out there in the grass for Corcoran to come and take. She didn't understand what she'd saved. She only knew she'd made a promise and broken it, and here, by grace or by a careless man's hurry, was one chance to half unbreak it. This one you keep. She would keep this one. Let them have all the rest. Let them have the play corn and the jars and the laughing. This one she'd keep, because she'd said she would. 30 years married, and this the last thing he asked. She stood at the window with her hand on the sill beside it, the dark red kernels glowing through the glass, and she felt, for the first time since the Tuesday, something that was almost peace. Small, but there. It didn't last the hour. Because there was still the desk to clear. She'd left it half done the night before the sale, the ledger set aside, the catalogs and receipts still to sort. And now, with the jar on the sill giving her a reason to touch his things gently again, she went to finish it. She pulled the little drawer all the way out to empty it. And behind it, wedged flat against the back of the desk where the drawer had hidden them for years, was a bundle of letters tied in string. Della carried them to the table and untied the string. Letters, dozens of them, going back years, all in the same fine steady hand that was not Amos's. The top one was on printed paper, and across the top it said, in raised black letters, State Agricultural College, Department of Agronomy. And below that, a name. Dr. Walter Prentice. She read the first one. She didn't understand the half of it. It was full of the same strange words as the ledger. Resistant line and mother seed and roguing and generations, but there were sentences in it that reached up off the page and took her by the throat, though she couldn't yet have said why. Amos, the letter said, you are further along than any man in this state, and you sit on it in a cellar. I say again what I said in the spring. Hold the mother seed back. Do not let it cross. And whatever you do, whatever they offer, don't let the companies have it. They will not do with it what you'd do. Yours, Prentice. Della read it twice. Don't let the companies have it. She set it down. Her hand had begun very slightly to shake. She reached for the next letter in the bundle. And out in the yard, faint, coming up the section road, she heard the labor of a truck. She went to the window. And there, growing in the dust, a rack on its back and gold letters on the door, the Corcoran truck was coming back for the rest. She set the letters down and went out to meet it. The truck came up slow, riding the ruts, the rack rattling empty on its back. Vernon's sledge had one arm out the window. He lifted 2 fingers off the door in a lazy wave, the way a man waves at a thing he already owns. He pulled into the yard where the crate still stood, and he cut the engine, and the quiet came back with the dust settling around it. Morning, Mrs. Hartwell. He climbed down. He was a big man, soft in the middle, and he wore his hat pushed back like he had nowhere to be. Come back for the rest of it. No sense me making 2 trips. The rest of what? Della said. The rest of the corn. He said it patient, the way you'd say a thing to a child. Your man kept more than what's in that crate. I know seed people, ma'am. A fellow don't fill 1 crate and quit. There'll be jars down cellar. Sealed ones, the good keeping. I'll give you another $1 for the lot, and we'll call it square. Della stood on her own step and looked at him. She thought about the shelf in the cellar, empty now, the dust ring where the last preserves had stood. She thought about the sealed row he was talking about. The row that wasn't there anymore because it was here. One jar of it, sitting behind her on the kitchen sill wound in red twine in her husband's hand. "There's no more corn," she said. "Now, ma'am." "There's no more corn, Misty. Sledge, you bought the crate." "The crate's what there was." He looked at her a long moment. Something moved in his face and settled. Not belief. He didn't believe her. But he was a man who knew that a widow 4 days into her widowing could not be pushed too hard in her own yard without it looking like what it was. He let his smile come back up. "All right," he said. "All right. I'll just take what I paid for then," he nodded at the crate. Load her up, and there it was. The thing she hadn't let herself think about since she carried the jar in from the cold. He was going to take the crate now. The rest of the jars, 20 years of them. And she had no reason on this earth to stop him, no reason she could say out loud, nothing but a bundle of letters on her table that she didn't understand, and a shaking in her hands she couldn't explain. "Wait," she said. He stopped with his hand on the crate. "I'd like the day," Della said. "To go through them. There might be. My mother's things got mixed in. Kitchen things. I sold in a hurry." It was a lie, and she heard it come out of her steady and plain, and she was almost frightened at how easy it was. "You come back this afternoon. I'll have your crate sorted and waiting, and you won't have to touch a thing." Vernon Sledge looked at the crate, and looked at her, and did the arithmetic of a man who did not want a scene. "Afternoon," he said. "I got a stop to make at the Corcoran yard anyhow." He tipped the pushed-back hat. "You're a sensible woman, Mrs. Hartwell. Sorry for your loss." And he said the sorry the way he'd said the morning, a thing you set down on a counter and don't look at again. He climbed back in the truck. He backed it around in the yard, and the empty rack rattled, and he went off down the section road the way he'd come. The dust standing up behind him and hanging in the still air a long time after the sound of him was gone. Della went back inside and sat down at the table with the letters. She read them all. It took her most of 2 hours, and she read some of them twice. And by the end of it, her tea had gone cold in the cup, and the light had moved across the floor. She didn't understand the half of the words. But she understood, by the end, the shape of the thing, the way you understand a field is flooded by the way the birds stand at the edge of it. There was a man named Prentice, a college man, out east at the state school, in the part of it that studied growing things. And he had been writing to Amos for years. Not down to Amos, the way a schooled man writes to a farmer. Across to him. As an equal. And sometimes, she read it 3 times to be sure, sometimes up to him. "You are further along than any man in this state." There were words she circled in her mind because they came back and back. Mother seed. The mother line. Hold it back. Rogue the weak ones. A resistant line. And over, near the end of them, a caution that got sharper each year, like a man raising his voice slow across a distance. Don't let the companies have it. Don't sell it to them. They'll not do with it what you would. And one line, in the last letter, dated only that past winter, that she read and then put her hand flat over, as though to keep it from lifting off the page. "Amos, you have made something a whole century of men have been trying to make. Now you have to live long enough to give it away right. Don't wait too long." Prentice. He had waited too long. Della sat with that. The clock on the shelf went on. Outside, the wind had come up a little and was working at the loose board on the north side of the porch, the one Amos always meant to fix, and never did, because he was always down in the back plot, fussing, the way the town said, fussing over corn. She got up. She went to the shelf by the stove, and she took down his ledger, the ear-to-row book. The one she'd thought was the scribbling of a man who should have been mending fence. She brought it to the table and she opened it beside the letters, and now, with the letters to light it, she began to read the columns. She still couldn't read all of it, but she could read enough. Rows crossed to rows. This ear out of that row. Saved. That row struck through. Killed, she understood now. Pulled up and thrown out. Because something in it was weak. Year after year after year. 20 of them. The same hand, getting a little less sure at the very end, the letters bigger. 20 years of a man walking down between 2 rows of corn in the evening after a full day's work in the cash fields, walking down slow and looking at every stalk, and killing the ones that weren't strong enough, and saving the ones that were, and doing it again the next year, and the next, patient as weather, keeping the strongest of the strong in sealed jars in the cold cellar so no bad year could take them. Keeping the very best of all of it, the mother of the whole line. In one jar he wound round with red twine and wrote on in his own hand, "Keep, do not sell." Della lifted her head and looked at that jar on the windowsill, and the afternoon light was coming through it, through the glass and through the pale gold kernels inside, and it threw a warm color on the sill like something lit from within, and she began finally, 4 days after they put him in the ground, to cry. Not for the money. She didn't understand yet that it was money. She cried because she had spent 30 years half believing the town, half believing that her patient quiet man had wasted their best years on a hobby in a backlot, and she had let him think she believed it, and she had never once, in 30 years, gone down between his rows in the evening and asked him what he was doing. And now she knew, and there was no one left in the house to tell that she knew. That was how the afternoon found her, and that was how the second car found her, because there was a second one, and she heard it before she saw it. And she thought at first it was Vernon's sledge back early, and she wiped her face hard with the heel of her hand and stood up. But it wasn't the Corcoran truck. It was a black automobile, road-dusted and travel-worn, a town car and no farm about it, and it came up the section road careful, slowing at the mailbox to read the name, and then turning in. A man got out. Older, spare, in a gray suit gone soft at the elbows, with round spectacles and a hat he took off the moment his feet touched the yard. Took off and held against his chest the way men do at a graveside. He stood there a second, looking at the house and at the crate in the yard, and something in him seemed to brace. Della came out onto the step. "Mrs. Hartwell?" he said. His voice was quiet, and it was schooled, and it was, right at that moment, unsteady. "My name is Walter Prentice. Forgive me. I've come a long way, and I've come, I'm afraid, too late. I read about Amos in the county paper only Monday. I meant to be here for the burying." He turned the hat in his hands. "He was my friend. Though we only met 3 times in 15 years, he was the best friend I had in this work. I'm so very sorry." Della came down the steps slow. "You're Prentice," she said, "from the college." His head came up a little. "He spoke of me?" "No," she said, "he never spoke of you once." And she watched the small hurt of that cross the man's face before she finished it. "But you're all over his desk. I found your letters this morning. Dozens of them. I've been reading them since." Something went through Walter Prentice then, she saw it. A kind of steadying, as though he'd been braced to explain from the ground up to a widow who knew nothing and had just been told he wouldn't have to. "Then you know," he said carefully, "a little of what he was doing." "I know I don't know the half of it," Della said. "I know there are words I can't read. Mother seed. Roguing, resistant. I know you kept telling him not to let the companies have it." She stopped. "That's all I know. I know I'm standing in the middle of something my husband spent 20 years on, and I never once asked him about it, and now you're the only man alive who can tell me what it was." Walter Prentice stood very still in the yard. Then his eyes moved. They went past her, slow, to the crate standing open in the dust, the wooden crate, the jars of seed corn packed in it, the afternoon sun striking through the shoulder of them. And he took a step toward it, and another, and he crouched down at the side of it with his old knees cracking. And he lifted one jar out and held it up to the light and turned it. Looking at the ears through the glass the way another man might look at a thing behind museum glass, and Della saw his lips move, counting, maybe, or naming, and she saw his hand not quite steady. "These are the culls," he said, almost to himself. The near lines. The ones that didn't quite come true. He set it down gentle. He looked up at her, and there was something coming into his face that she couldn't name. Mrs. Hartwell, where is the rest? He'd have kept the true line separate, sealed. He'd have had one jar he guarded above all the others. Where is it? And Della Hartwell turned her head and looked back at her own kitchen window, at the jar sitting on the sill in the low gold light, wound round with red twine. Walter Prentice followed her look. She heard him make a sound. It wasn't a word. It was the sound a man makes when the air goes out of him. He got up off his knees, and he didn't seem to feel them now, and he walked past her toward the house, and Della went with him, and they came into the kitchen together, and he stopped in front of the sill, and he did not touch the jar. He stood over it with his hands held back at his sides like a man before an altar. And he read the twine and the writing on it, "Keep, do not sell," in Amos's plain hard hand, and Della watched the blood go out of his face. He turned pale. She had heard people say it, and she had never rightly seen it, but she saw it now, saw the color leave a living man's face from the brow down, saw his lips go white, and when he spoke his voice had no bottom to it. "Mrs. Hartwell," he said, "your husband didn't fail. Missy Prentice, he didn't fail." He put out one finger and let it rest barely on the red twine and drew it back. "Do you know what this is? Do you have the first idea what you have got sitting on your kitchen windowsill in the sun?" He turned and looked at her, and his eyes were wet and wide. He beat the blight. Do you hear me? He beat it. Years ago. A corn that stands through the drought and stands through the rot both. An open pollinated line a farmer can save back himself, year on year, and never buy again. A thing every man in my department has broken his life against and not got. And Amos Hartwell made it in a backlot with a hoe and a jar and 20 years of doing it right, and there is not a seed house in this country that wouldn't sell its soul for what is in that jar. The kitchen was very quiet. "It was in the crate," Della said. Her own voice sounded far off to her. "The jars. All of it. I sold it. Yesterday, in front of the whole town. For $1. No." Prentice shook his head hard. "No, listen to me. The crate is the culls. I told you. The near lines, the also rans, the ones he kept for his own records, but that never came true. A man who works the way Amos worked keeps the true mother line back, always, apart from everything, sealed, marked so no one takes it by mistake." He looked again at the jar on the sill, and his voice dropped. "He marked it. He wound it in twine, and he wrote on it, and he set it apart. And by every mercy in heaven it is still here." He turned to her, and something struck him, and he said, slower, "How is it still here? If you sold the crate, how is this one jar sitting on your sill?" And Della had to sit down. She sat down at her own table, among the letters, and she told him how the crate had been left behind in the yard that morning, forgotten or not worth the second trip. How she'd gone out to it in the cold before the sun was full up, not to save anything, not knowing anything, just to touch his things one more time before they went. How her hand had gone by itself to the one jar with the red twine on it, because it was the one thing he'd ever asked of her. Out loud once. "Keep that one, Della, whatever comes. Don't ever sell that one." And how she'd broken that and every other promise the day before at the sale, but standing there in the cold yard she had reached in and lifted that single jar out of the crate and carried it into the house and set it on the sill. For no reason she could have told anyone, only that she couldn't let that one go. Walter Prentice listened to all of it standing up, and when she finished he had to steady himself with a hand on the back of a chair. "You saved it," he said. "Without knowing. The one jar, the only one that mattered in all of it. You reached into that crate and you took out the one jar your husband spent his life protecting, and you left the man from Corcoran the culls." He gave a sound that was half a laugh and half something else. And he sat down across from her heavy and put his face briefly in his hand. "Amos," he said, into his hand. "You got lucky in your wife, you old fool. Luckier than you deserved. But then he lifted his head, and the relief went out of his face, and the fear came back into it, and Della saw it come. "The crate," he said. "Where is the crate now?" "In the yard," Della said, sorted and waiting. "Vernon Sledge is coming back for it this afternoon. He thinks there's more in the cellar. He said so, loud, in front of everybody at the sale. I'll take the fool's corn off your hands. He came back this morning wanting the sealed jars from the cellar. I sent him off till afternoon." She stopped. "That's who bought it. Corcoran Seed and Grain." The name landed on Walter Prentice like a blow. He went still all over. "Corcoran," he said. "You know them. Know them." His voice was low and even now, and worse for it. "Mrs. Hartwell, I have watched Corcoran Seed and Grain court your husband for 6 years. Letters. A man to the door. Twice. Money. Real money. More money than this farm has seen in its life. They wanted his line, and they wanted it bought and buried. Do you understand? Not to sell to farmers. To own. To lock up, or to cross into one of their patent hybrids and sell back at a price that would break every man in this county who tried to plant it, and then only for 1 season, so he'd have to come and buy again every spring for the rest of his life. That is the whole of their business. A seed a man can't save. And Amos made the opposite of that. A seed a man saves forever and owns free. That's why they wanted it dead. And that's why he wrote no every time, for 6 years, and told me he'd give it to the college and the co-op before he'd give Corcoran the satisfaction of 1 kernel. He stood up. And now their fieldman is driving back into this yard this afternoon to carry the last of it off. For $1. The culls, Della said. You said the crate's only the culls. It is. Prentice went to the window and looked down the empty section road, the way a man watches weather. But Vernon Sledge doesn't know that. And a man like that, once he's got the culls in hand and starts to grow them out and sees what even the culls will do, he'll come back. And back. He'll never believe a widow doesn't have the rest. He'll make your life a misery from now till the note comes due, and then he'll be standing at the auction when the bank takes the ground, and he'll buy the farm out from under you and dig for it himself. He turned around. How long? The note. 9 weeks, Della said. $1,180. Prairie Trust. Walter Prentice took his spectacles off and rubbed the bridge of his nose. And put them back on, and when he'd done it he was a different man, decided, the tremble gone out of him and something dry and hard come into its place. Then we've got a great deal to do before that truck comes back, he said, and not much afternoon to do it in. Mrs. Hartwell, I need you to hear the one thing that changes all of this. Are you listening? I'm listening. 4 years ago your husband sent me, at the college, a full set of seed samples of this line and a fair copy of his breeding ledger, that ledger, or its twin, and a signed account in his hand of how he made it and over what years. It is filed, it is dated, it is witnessed. It sits in the vault of the Department of Agronomy of the State Agricultural College under one name and one name only. He tapped the table. Hartwell, Amos Hartwell of Marl Creek is the recorded breeder of this strain. On paper, 4 years standing, and no company on God's earth can stand up and claim they made it. Because we can produce the day he made it and the day he lodged it, and they can produce nothing but a receipt for $1. He leaned in. Do you understand what that means? It means the credit can't be stolen. And it means the seed has a home to go to that isn't Corcoran. And it means you, Mrs. Hartwell, are not a poor widow sitting on a jar you can't defend. You are the widow and heir of the registered breeder of the most valuable open corn in this state, and I am the college's witness to it. And I am sitting at your table. Della looked at him. She looked at the jar on the sill. She looked at the letters spread out among the crumbs of her own mourning, and the ledger open beside them, and she felt the ground of the last 4 days shift once more under her feet, and this time shift the right way. Then when Vernon Sledge comes back, she said slowly, for his crate. This afternoon. in front of whoever's about. Yes, let him come, Della said. He came at 4. He came in the truck with the rack, and this time he didn't come alone in the yard, because a thing had gone round Marl Creek the way things go round a small town, which was that a strange black automobile had sat all afternoon in the widow Hartwell's yard, and one by one, on one excuse and another, the neighbors had drifted up the section road to see Tom Ackley from the quarter east, who'd stood at the sale, the 2 women who'd bought Della's mother's dishes for next to nothing and had the grace now to look uneasy, Polly the auctioneer, who happened to be passing and did not happen to keep passing, a dozen of them, and then near 2 dozen, standing along the fence and in the yard the way they'd stood the day before, the same 40-odd faces, or enough of them, and that was exactly as Walter Prentice had hoped, though Della had done nothing to gather them and would not have known how. Vernon Sledge climbed down and saw the crowd and read it wrong. He read it as an audience. He liked an audience. He pushed his hat back and he came across the yard rubbing his hands. Afternoon, all, he nodded round like a man at his own barn raising. Come to see the last of Amos's corn go off, have you? He grinned. Well, $1 bought it, and $1 hauls it. Mrs. Hartwell, I'll take my crate now, and if you've thought better about them cellar jars I'll go another $1 generous, seeing as you're widowed and all. Mr. Sledge Walter Prentice stepped down off the porch. Vernon looked at him. The grin held, but the eyes went careful. And you'd be? Walter Prentice, Department of Agronomy, State Agricultural College. He came across the yard unhurried, and he had the ledger under his arm and a folded college paper in his hand, and he stopped a good easy distance from Vernon Sledge where the whole fence line could hear him. And he did not raise his voice, which made every soul there lean in to catch it. I believe you and I have never met. But I know your company well, Mr. Sledge. I've spent 6 years reading letters your company wrote to the man who's buried up on that hill. Now I don't know what Corcoran Seed Grain, Prentice said, offered Amos Hartwell money for this corn 6 times in 6 years. He said it out flat to the crowd, not to Vernon at all. I have the dates. I have his answers. He turned you down every time, and he told me why, and I'll tell these good people why. Because they've a right to it, having watched you carry his life off yesterday for the price of a sack of flour. He turned, now, and let his eyes go along the fence line, along the neighbors. The corn in that crate, and the seed this man spent 20 years making. It's a corn that stands through blight and drought both. Tom Ackley. He found the face. You told Mrs. Hartwell yourself. The summer of the bad year, whose corn stood green when the whole county burned. Tom Ackley took his hat off. Amos's, he said. His back plot. Only green corn in the township. He swallowed. We never asked him how. He'd have told you, Prentice said gently. He'd have given you the seed for the asking, at cost, to save yourself and to save it. Because that is what he wanted. A corn every farmer here could grow and save back and grow again forever, free, owing no company a dime. He turned back to Vernon Sledge, and his voice never rose and never had to. And that, Mr. Sledge, is exactly why your company wanted it dead. A seed a man saves is a seed he doesn't buy. Corcoran doesn't sell corn that comes true. Corcoran sells corn that quits after 1 season, so the farmer's back at your counter every spring with his hat in his hand. You didn't come to buy Amos Hartwell's life work yesterday to grow it. You came to bury it. For $1, in front of his widow. The yard had gone dead still. Vernon Sledge's face had begun to change. The grin was long gone. A red was coming up out of his collar. He looked at the fence line, at the neighbors, and the neighbors were looking back at him now, and it was not the looking of yesterday. Yesterday they had watched a widow take a coin and been sorry for her and a little ashamed and gone home. Today they were doing the arithmetic Prentice had handed them, and their faces were turning, one and then another, the way a field turns under a wind, and Vernon Sledge stood in the middle of it and felt it turn. His mouth worked. That's a lie. "You can't. That corn's mine. Bought and paid. I got the receipt." He pulled it out, a fool's motion, a scrap of paper, and held it up. And it was the worst thing he could have done, because it was true, and everyone could see it was $1 receipt for a dead man's 20 years, and the holding of it up made them hate it. "The corn in the crate is yours," Prentice agreed. "Take it. It's the culls." He let that sit, the near lines. The rejects he kept for his records. "Grow them out, Mr. Sledge, and see. They'll be a fair corn and no more, and they'll not come true past a season, and they'll break your heart if you were expecting the thing itself. Because the thing itself, the mother line, 20 years of it, the true blood of the whole strain, is not in your crate. It never was. It is registered 4 years standing with the college, under Amos Hartwell's name and no other. Witnessed and dated and past your reach forever. Your company can't claim it, can't name it, can't own one kernel of it." And the seed itself, he did not say where it was. He did not so much as glance at the kitchen window, and Della loved him for that. The seed itself is safe, and it's going where he wanted it to go. To these people. At cost. The way he meant. Somebody along the fence laughed. It wasn't a cruel laugh. It was the short, surprised bark of a man watching a thing come right side up after a day and a night of being wrong side down. And then another, and Tom Ackley walked forward without a word, past Vernon's sledge, and set his hand on the crate in the yard, and looked at Della. "This oughtn't to have gone for $1, he said. "Company or no, I'll not watch it go off this yard on that truck." And he took hold of the crate, the culls, the worthless culls, but they didn't know that, and it didn't matter what they knew. It was the principle of the thing standing up at last in Marl Creek, and he lifted it and carried it back and set it down on the Hartwell porch, and stood in front of it. Vernon Sledge looked at his dollar receipt in his hand. There was nothing in it for him now. He could stand on the letter of it and drag a widow's crate off a porch through a crowd that had turned all the way against him, and be the man in every kitchen in the county for the next 20 years who did that. Or he could go. Della watched him understand there was no version of the afternoon he walked out of well. His face had gone from red to a kind of gray. He opened his mouth twice, and no line came, no charity, no kindness, no $1's worth of the smooth thing he'd walked in on. He put the receipt back in his pocket. He climbed up in the truck with the rack empty behind him, the way he'd come. And he backed it round in the yard, and this time nobody moved to help him, and the dust stood up behind him and hung in the 4 o'clock light, and Vernon's sledge drove out of Marl Creek and did not come back to it. The neighbors stayed a while. That was the town, too. They'd been part of the wrong, and now they wanted to be part of the setting right, and Della let them, because Amos would have. Somebody brought a ham up that evening. The 2 women who'd bought her mother's dishes brought them back and wouldn't take the money. It was small. It didn't fix the 4 days. But it was the town coming back around, and she took it the way you take rain after a dry spell, without asking it where it had been. The rest went quick, the way the important things do once the hard part's behind them. Walter Prentice stayed the week, and wrote his letters, and the college wrote its letters, and a thing was arranged that Amos would have knelt down and thanked God for, though he'd never have said so out loud. The mother seed in the red twine jar went east to the college, not sold, lodged, and from it they would grow the true line-up, careful, season on season, the way he had, and give it out through a farmer's seed cooperative at cost, farm to farm, a seed a man could save and own free, exactly and only as Amos Hartwell had wanted it. And because the strain was his, registered and witnessed under his name, there was a royalty set on the increase of it, a plain and fair one that came to Della. The Monday after, she sat at her kitchen table across from a man from the co-op and a man from Prairie Trust Bank, and there was a plain agreement on the table, and she read all of it this time, slow, every line, the way she should have read her whole life, and she signed it. And then Mr. Harlan Beck of Prairie Trust took out the note, the $1,180 that had hung over the farm like weather, and he marked it paid. in ink, and turned it round so she could see. And Della Hartwell put her hand flat on Amos's ledger where it lay open beside the paper, flat on his crossed-out rows and his 20 years, and she kept it there a moment, and said nothing, and that was the whole of what she had to say. She kept the farm, the 40 acres and the roof one more season, and the ones after that. 2 years on, the weather came for the county the way it had in the bad year, the drought first, cracking the ground, and then the blight behind it, riding in on the dry wind, and the corn went down across Nebraska, field on field, the tall green going gray and folding. The same old grief that had bent farmers since there were farmers. Della stood at her fence in the August of it and watched it come across the sections. And the Hartwell corn stood. It stood green across Marl Creek and out past it, in Tom Ackley's quarter and the Pauley ground, and a dozen farms beyond. Wherever a man had gone to the cooperative and got the seed at cost and put it in the ground, it stood up green and full through the drought and through the rot both. The only green in a gray county. The way one backplot had stood green the year they buried nobody and asked nobody how. Only now it wasn't one plot. It was everywhere. It was passed farm to farm at a price a man could pay, and saved back at every harvest to plant again free, and it would go on being passed and saved long after everyone who'd laughed at Amos and his jars was in the ground beside him. And that was the whole of what he'd been after, down between his rows in the evening, all those years the town thought he was wasting. They didn't call it fussing anymore. Somewhere off in the state, a company called Corcoran Seed Grain went on selling corn that quit after a season, and had a field man once, so the story went, who'd saved a widow a whole $1 on a crate of worthless jars. And that story got told around the county for years, dry, at the end of an evening, when somebody wanted to laugh at how sure a clever man can be, and how wrong. Della Hartwell grew old on the farm. On the summer evenings she'd sit out on the porch Amos never did fix the loose board on, and she fixed it herself finally, and she'd watch the light go down gold over corn that was his in every field she could see. On the kitchen sill, washed and empty now, the seed all gone into the ground where it belonged, sat one mason jar with a length of faded red twine still wound around it, and his hand still on it, plain and hard, keep, do not sell. She kept it. Some men build a thing in silence and never explain themselves, and let the world call them fools, and just go on down the rows in the evening, doing it right, trusting the harvest to say it for them when they're gone. Amos Hartwell was one of those. It cost him being understood in his own life. It didn't cost him the thing itself. The corn stood. It's standing yet. If you've got a quiet one in your family, the one who built something nobody saw the worth of till later, tell me about them, and tell me what town you're watching this from. I'd like to know where all of you are.